Greetings, class. Welcome to Change Management 6113 class. Change management is very foundational from a business administration standpoint, especially in today's world. Businesses are going through changes every second as they try to produce their products and services, as they try to compete in the marketplace, as they optimize their operations. Technology, especially, has infiltrated the business paradigms, transforming the way product and services are being delivered to the marketplace. So this is a very fun class, and this class and the reading gives a wealth of information regarding the foundational aspect of change management. I strongly recommend, in order to build the proficiency of principles of change management, reviewing the real-time case studies. The textbook presents a lot of case studies. Reviewing those case studies is instrumental to build the knowledge base that one needs regarding how large companies have applied change management and how those changes have shifted, either positive, meaning growth and expansion, or negative, meaning decline and collapse of service lines, business plans, business models, so on and so forth. So before we jump in, I saw a few names that I'm familiar with. So for those of you who do not know me, I am Dr. Ajit Nair. I'm working as Director of Strategy and Analytics in University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Center based in Houston. My focus is in healthcare, market research, cancer program planning, understanding the nature of cancer programs in terms of growth, in terms of diversifications, in terms of specialized planning, coming from different angles, coming from demand management, coming from supply chain, coming from market share, competitiveness, so on and so forth. My passion is, how do I take different kinds of teams and inculcate the discipline and principles so that the team can be performing at the highest level, and how the team can be agile. As we discussed early when we started the class, the agility is going to be extremely critical when we think about the business world today. Everything we are doing today is going to be only a historic significance when we look at tomorrow. So agility is going to be an essential characteristic of professionals, individuals, teams, departments, divisions, and the company, so that they can look at tomorrow's customers, tomorrow's employees, tomorrow's operations, tomorrow's competitive nature, and how effectively business models will be able to survive tomorrow. I have doctorate in business administration from University of Southwest. I also have double masters in computer science and geosciences. One of my current hobby is how best we would be able to bring the courage, the faith, and hope among patients who are going through chronic illness like cancer, because their opportunity to interact with the clinical team and physician team is very limited. And when they go home, either after an inpatient stay or after a doctor's visit, typically they have a lot of questions. How will we design a technology solution, an empathetic technology solution, leveraging the capabilities of artificial intelligence and AI agents, and see how best we would be able to bring that kind of a change in the healthcare system, which is more patient-centric. And from a physician perspective, how will they understand these patients more from a personalized manner rather than following a generic way of understanding the disease prognosis or the progression of disease within each patient. Now let's jump into the textbook that we have to study. The textbook is a fun textbook to read. I studied this same textbook, and I am going through this textbook in more detailed manner. Dr. Hayes is a very well-known change management, business administration, well-spoken professional in this field. You would definitely enjoy the reading of this textbook, and even reading about his other work in the business administration. He's a truly distinguished scholar. He's an expert in the field of organizational change management or change management happening at large companies. And his work clearly focused on understanding the dynamics of change within large enterprises, leadership strategies, and how individuals and teams would adapt to transformation. We always say in hindsight, it is 2020. So revealing these case studies, he has assembled lots of case studies from pioneering organizations which has made a wave in the corporate world. So reading those case studies, understanding what has been done, and how did the organization, the teams, the departments, and the divisions thought about the disruptors that are happening in the marketplace, and how they reacted to it is critical for us to understand the historical significance of it. So we as business administration professionals are truly built with the tenacity of the knowledge, and we are equipped with a historical understanding by which we can design, or we can at least prepare ourselves to handle the disruptors. From an academic and professional background, he has contributed extensively to study of the change management through teaching, through research, and through consultancy. And his experience spans across various industries. And he helped organizations, several kinds of organizations, whether it's like energy, whether it's transportation, whether it's finance, to navigate changes through strategic inventions. And his work is widely recognized in business schools as well as in professional management programs worldwide. He has authored several books, and he has several articles on change management, leadership, and organizational behavior. And the core philosophy of his work and his approach to change management is holistic, it's structured, and it is process-driven. Starting with the first chapter, you would see that he is building a case where change has to be dealt from a process-driven perspective. He emphasized that change is not like a one-time event, but a continuous journey that requires planning, implementation, and reinforcement. So he brings to us different kinds of theories of change: teleological, dialectical, life cycle, evolutionary models. He also brings in how different kind of leadership roles can influence this change. He highlights the criticality of engaging all of the stakeholders that are involved in the change. And he sets the reality of the iterative nature of the change. So you need to understand the technical, the business, the human aspect, and come up with a way by which you can address emotions, organizational culture, resistance to change, typical human behavior, and leadership influence when you think about structural and operational changes. So his work is very structured, very well structured, but flexible and agile in terms of understanding and implementing changes effectively. Now, you could see the way he organized his textbook. The textbook is organized into 8 key parts. Each part focuses on the foundation element of the change life cycle. So part 1 is giving a process perspective to manage change. Part 2 really focuses on the first step. How do we recognize the need for the change? There is a saying I remember, if something is working and producing the results, it's better not to change it. But there are so many opportunities that process would present to you that it needs a change. The declining nature of the efficiency, the utilization of resources, the market share progressions, all of those would indicate that even though it is working today, tomorrow it might need a change. So how do we recognize the need for change? Then that chapter or that section, so part 1 has 2 chapters. Part 2 has 5 chapters. Those 5 chapters build the foundation for part 3, diagnosing what needs to be changed. It has 2 chapters. Part 4 would be planning and preparing for the change with 5 chapters. Part 5 probably is the longest part with 8 chapters, leading and managing people issues. At the end of the day, people play a very critical role in embodying the change. And then part 6 would be focusing on implementation of the change. Not only you need to implement, you need to sustain the change, which is part 7. Both part 6 and part 7 has 2 chapters. And then this textbook closes with everything that you can learn from the change perspective. Now, all of these textbook has been compiled under several modules. Each module will be covered in our weekly learning. There are 8 modules for 8 weeks. We go through all of the chapters. I believe we skipped chapter 9, but essentially we would be covering the entire textbook with 29 chapters. It's going to be a fun read. I strongly suggest each and every one of you to read the chapters. Every week I will be posting video lectures. For the first 2 chapters, we will go through the fundamental aspects that has been discussed in the textbook. But in a very short video session, it will be very difficult to cover all of the different aspects of the fundamentals of learning from the textbook, which might cover each week anywhere between 2 to 8 chapters. So it is critical for all of you to review the textbook. It's a fun read. It's not like a long, laborious read. Since many of these really applies to even our personal life, you can think about change coming from different angles and how do you deal with change, not only in enterprise, but also in our personal life. So this textbook truly prepares you for thinking, like building a mindset on how we can deal with change. How can we look at all of the contributors of the change? How do we understand those contributors of the change? How do we build a process perspective towards the change? How do we bring about the change and implement the change consistently and sustainably? How do we apply the principles of learning so that we can continue to go through the change? So we went through Dr. Hayes' contributions, amazing experience, a wealth of knowledge from organizational change perspective, a unique blend of academic, scholarly, industry-wide expertise and experience Dr. Hayes presents to us. And it is reflected throughout his textbook so that you would be able to uh, truly follow how the principles of change has been applied by different institutions. I have tried to bring the latest and greatest case studies from disruptors from well-known organizations like Amazon, how they applied change, Microsoft, Apple, Netflix, so on and so forth. So my examples are slightly different from the textbook, so you can understand from both flavors. There's no point in duplicating the same case studies or examples, which you can read from the textbook. So this week, we are going to cover two chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 gives the perspective where we can fine-tune our mindset to understand change from a process perspective and reviewing some of the process models that are applied or that can be traditionally applied towards a change. And those principles would build the chapter 2, where we can truly look at leading the change from a process perspective. So those two chapters would build the foundational aspect for part 2, where we are going to recognize whether we need a change or not. Without understanding these two chapters, it's very difficult for us to build that business acumen or the change management acumen to recognize that something needs to be changed. So in this chapter, we will explore the process perspective of change management. And by end of this chapter, you will develop a very strong foundation of understanding how change unfolds as a process, the theories that explain the change, and the key dynamics that shape the change trajectories. Change is not a one-time event. We would probably repeat the statement many times during this course so that we can build change as part of our system, as part of our knowledge. So change is an evolving process which requires continuous assessment and adaptation. Whether it is our daily pattern, daily behavior, whether it is the discipline by which we approach something, whether we work in a team environment, whether multiple teams come together and produce something that's of unique, whether that product or service is being sold in the industry, in the market, whether we collaborate with other institutions, understanding the competitive nature by which others approach the same problem, all of those requires continuous assessment and adaptation. So here we will examine how change occurs from a third perspective and identifying the stages that the organizations would go through when implementing a change. We will then look at different kinds of process theories of change. There are 4 key process theories which has been highlighted. The teleological theory, where you say that change is a goal-driven or an adaptive process. Then there is a dialectical theory, where it says change is a result of a conflict and power struggles. Or it's a life cycle theory. Change is a predictable progression through different phases. And then we bring in the evolutionary theory. Change is an ongoing adaptation adaptation, ongoing adaptation to environmental pressures. So change has been looked into 4 different ways. And you can think about how the outcome of these changes happened, navigate this back to one or more of these theories. Then in the section 3, we look at the change trajectories. Because many times we know change doesn't follow a linear path. Even going through this program, whether you're finishing a bachelor's in business administration, master's in business administration, or taking a PhD, we know that it's not a linear path. The course and the curriculum and the program is built as a linear path, but there are so many changes that would happen in our life, in our academic pursuit, that we know that change is incremental. It should happen every day, rather than putting all the work on like Sunday and getting the coursework and everything completed. It would be much easier if the student, in a disciplined way, focus and put the effort Sunday through Sunday or Monday through Sunday. So the change of building that new knowledge set into your system is incremental. But if you focus on Sunday and get everything done, we can say it's a disruptive change, because you're going to disrupt the whole schedule and pathway for Sunday and then put all the effort to bring out that change. This is true for companies. The companies need to evaluate their environmental conditions so that they can make the change as part of their culture and incrementally build those change rather than focus on a disruptive change. So change trajectories of different companies and how different companies have, or how different markets have adopted this, and how the outcome of those change has reflected in human life, has been the discussion points in the trajectories, change trajectories. Then we would look into 3 major paths: the reactive way of change sequence, the self-reinforcing sequences, or how the past decisions shape the trajectory of the change from a path-dependent standpoint. And then we will close this to look at the negative effects and how did companies mitigated the negative effects. When we finish this chapter, you will definitely have a comprehensive understanding of how change unfolds, the different factors that influence its trajectory, and how the strategic approaches established by companies was successful or unsuccessful in managing this change effectively. And with this knowledge, you will be better prepared to recognize change, understand how other companies have navigated and led change in a very complex organizational settings. So now let's take a look at the different sections of the change. So this is a very powerful quote, which I love. Change is the law of life. And those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. So John F. Kennedy, he clearly highlighted that future is not a representation of present or past. Even though I don't fully agree with that, the latest and greatest trends that is happening in technology, artificial intelligence, machine language, so on and so forth, clearly communicates to us the movies that we saw in the past is now becoming reality when we think about future. So understanding change management explores the critical role that change managers play in identifying, initiating, and guiding successful change initiatives. So the first step is, how do we recognize the need for change? Every system, every organization, every company should evolve to meet the new challenges, changing market conditions, or even reflecting the internal inefficiencies. So change management, even though the textbook talks about change leaders, I would suggest that every employee of the company should have different elements of change leadership. They should actively identify areas for improvement, and they should proactively address gaps before those gaps or those areas of improvement become obstacles. And without timely action, every organization, every individual risk falling behind the competitors, losing that operational efficiency, or failing to meet the stakeholder expectation or our customer expectation. So not only change managers must respond to change, but they should also anticipate change and act strategically to secure that meaningful transformation. Now let's take a look at why does many projects fail or many change projects fail. So there are several key reasons that has been highlighted: resistance to change, lack of a clear vision, leadership support, poor communication, inadequate planning, or not allocating resources that this particular change need. So these failure points needs to be recognized early in the life cycle, which allows leaders to design a more resilient change strategy. The third responsibility of the change management is always to look change as a structured process or brings a process perspective, focusing on the how of the transformation. Change management is not just about making decisions, but guiding the people through the transformation so that the resistance of the people towards change can be minimized or transformed to fun, to excitement, to adoption, and looking into a new world. Many times employees, when they hear about change, they fear about their job. That fear needs to be changed or transformed into courage, into faith, into hope, where you can apply a systematic process and the entire organization buy into that process. So in this section, we focus on how of the transformation, breaking down the phases, the patterns, and the obstacles in the change process. Change managers play the role of reactive and self-reinforcing sequences. Often the reality is many organizations experience pushbacks, delays, and unintended consequences from from the marketplace. And they react or they self-reinforce. So reactive sequences occur when you oppose the change, leading to unexpected obstacles that slow down or reverse the progress. The self-reinforcing strategies can either strengthen or weaken the change efforts depending on how they are managed. It doesn't matter, the ultimate goal is better outcome. Change management is all about finding alternative ways to achieve better outcomes. Change agents many times must step back, assess the situation, and adapt their approach when necessary. Flexibility and continuous learning are key to ensuring that change effort deliver lasting benefits. So change is not about execution. It's all about learning, adapting, and optimizing the process for success. So thus, by understanding change management as a structured, strategic, iterative process, leaders can effectively guide organizations through transformation with clarity, confidence, and efficiency. Now let's take a look at how different change models and theories help us manage the organizational change. So we briefly touch base on these four theories. The teleological theory, which views change as purposeful and an adaptive process. Many organizations under this theory see change as a goal-driven entities. Leaders set objectives, implement strategies, evaluate outcomes, and refine approaches like a textbook model. The change process here is not linear, but iterative, involving continuous learning and adaptation. Let's take a look at a tech startup. I briefed regarding a tech startup that I am actively involved in. So we focus on developing a new AI-driven healthcare platform. So we set a vision, we build a prototype, we experiment that prototype in a controlled setting. Based on the results and outcome, we refine or expand that prototype, gather feedback from patients, feedback from the users, physicians. We adjust the features. We refine the solution based on an evolving goal. We also learn from the market, and then we build the next version of the prototype into a product version 0. And that product version 0 will be iterated on and on and on, version 1, version 2, version 3. All of those is part of the teleological change. It's intentional, it is strategic, it's adaptive. Now let's take a look at the next theory, dialectical theory. Dialectical theory explains change as a result of conflicting forces where there is an opposing interest compete for the dominance. So change occurs when power struggles between different groups or stakeholders create the pressure for transformation. It emphasizes conflict resolution and negotiation as crucial elements for managing change. For example, where there are companies with large workforce and labor unionized, the labor strike, where employees demand higher wages and better working condition, which will lead to negotiations between workers and management, and that will result many times into policy changes and improved benefits. Here, change is driven by opposition and confrontation. It requires very strong leadership, exceptional negotiation and resolution strategies. Dialectical, the word itself shows two opposing forces creating that change. Now let's take a look at life cycle theories. The life cycle, the word itself, shows the change as predictable sequential process which follows the natural stage of development, whereas each stage build upon the previous one, ensure cumulative progression. So many of the companies in healthcare where you need a stable delivery of services, stable products, which act as the agent for life and death, need to follow a life cycle theory or life cycle strategy. Let's take an example of a pharma company. They develop a new drug, and it follows a very strict life cycle. They go through the R&D or research and development phase. R&D will start a clinical trial. They go through the regulatory approvals that is needed. With the results from the clinical trial and the approvals, they follow a market launch, and then there will be a post-market surveillance, and you cannot skip any of these steps. And if you skip, it will create inefficiencies. So here change occurs in this, and success is purely dependent on proper planning and adherence to a structured process. The last that we would discuss today are the evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory, as the word says, change is continuous, change is incremental, change is influenced by external forces and how organizations adapt to those forces. So change results from variation, selection, and retention, very similar to what we have studied in biology, principles of natural evolution. And organizations adapt to these market shifts. They have to respond to that market shift by technology, by operations, by process, by resources, and maintain their competitive advantage over time. If we take a look at companies like Netflix, they started as a DVD rental service. Now it's a global entertainment streaming giant. They continuously adapted technology changes and consumer demands. Here, change was gradual and responsive, driven by environmental pressures, competition, and long-term sustainability. So each of these change theories offers a unique lens to understand how transformation unfolds in organization. Teleological theory emphasizes goal setting and learning. Dialectical theory focuses on conflict-driven change. Life cycle theory follows a very structured and sequential stages. Evolutionary theory describes a gradual adaptation towards the change. Now let's take a look at the different ordering of stages. So we saw some theories emphasize the sequence of stages in change process more than others. Now, when we look at Microsoft shift to cloud computing, Microsoft historically relied on software licensing models for its products like Windows and Office Suite. But they clearly recognize there is a rise of cloud computing. It might threaten this traditional model. Responding to that, Microsoft embarked on a deliberated transformation, shifting from software to a cloud-based services like Microsoft Azure and Office 365. So they recognize the need for change, that clear goal to become a cloud company. I still remember the slogan, cloud first company. So there are so many other examples where the goal-driven transformation, how the outcome of the cloud market leadership was established by this team. So before we go into the details of some of these examples, let's take a look into the different life cycle theories. Life cycle theories, as we defined, are more prescriptive, defining each stage as a progression coming from the previous stage. Teleological theory focuses on iterative goal setting and evaluation. And many times the stages in change process, as we discussed, is not a linear path. And effective change management definitely requires preparation of the organization and team to navigate different kinds of uncertainties that can happen in different stages of the organization. So we talked about the teleological theory and how Microsoft applied those teleological theory. It's very important to look at how companies like Microsoft can recognize these changes, how the transformation happens within the company, and the outcome that the company experienced. So the goal-driven approach, in this case, helped Microsoft very successfully navigating a competitive industry shift and to secure a long-term growth. Let's take a look at how a dialectical theory has been applied in case of Uber and the taxi service. So we know traditional taxis are highly regulated structures with fixed pricing, government permits, and unionized drivers. So Uber came up with a truly new business model based on rides following an app. The pricing is dynamic, and the drivers are independent contractors. Definitely, this created a conflict with not only with the existing taxi companies, unions, and regulators who saw Uber as an unfair competitor. Uber, in this case, followed the dialectical change theory, where they challenged the status quo, which triggered resistance from traditional taxi services. So Uber faced legal battles. Uber was banned in cities like London, New York, and Paris. Taxi unions protested Uber. Uber drivers did not have to adhere the same regulations and insurance requirements like taxi. And regulators attempted to restrict Uber's operation, citing so many different areas. I remember reading reports: unfair employment, workers' rights, passenger safety concerns, unfair pricing, so on and so forth. But customer demand was growing higher than any of these reports that came out, because customers found it affordable, customers found it convenient, customers found the app-based booking much more effective. Even the transportation, the cars are much more sophisticated than the regular taxi. So the opposition between Uber and taxi industry perfectly represent the dialectical theory, where you can see conflicting interest is driving. Now let's take a look at the outcome. Outcome was a transformation happening as an industry-wide. So traditional taxi companies were forced by implementing their own ride-hailing apps. So every taxi company then came up with their own apps. And they changed the pricing models into a dynamic pricing model. Many cities adapted to new regulations to govern what I would say is the gig economy services, not only in Uber, in other industries, the catering, the food delivery, and all of those things, to create a more balanced playing field. The success of Uber reshaped the urban mobility, leading to other companies like Uber, the Lyft, the Bolt, and other competitors in the same space. Some taxi companies also formed alliances with these companies, integrating hybrid models of operation. So this clearly demonstrated how the conflict and opposition can lead to fundamental industry-wide transformation. Now let's take a look at a life cycle theory being applied in the case of Apple's iPhone. So in 2007, Apple launched the first iPhone, revolutionizing the mobile phone industry. And if you look since 2007, they continuously innovated by introducing new features. They came up with App Store. They came up with Face ID. They came up with 5G connectivity. All of those truly benefited a very structured way by which Apple can bring the product life cycle to a mature model, whereas Samsung and others couldn't compete with them. So when you look at how they applied this theory, they went through a structured series of life cycle stages. There is an innovation stage, there is a growth stage, there is a maturity stage, renewal stage. So Apple then diversified its portfolio. They came up with different kinds of wearables, the Apple Watch, the AirPods, and all of those devices. They also brought in services like iCloud, Apple Pay, Apple Music, Apple TV Plus. So they embraced a full product life cycle, ensuring a long-term success beyond just the iPhone. The outcome was market dominance through continuous reinvention. Apple sustained its dominance by continuously refreshing its product line. The iPhone remains the center of an ecosystem that integrates services, software, and hardware. Despite the market situation, Apple remained very competitive through their cutting-edge innovation and customer loyalty. Now let's take a look at another disruptor or another change that has been applied through evolutionary theory. This is where Netflix comes into play. Netflix started the DVD rental by mail, through mail, I believe as early as in 1996-97 timeframe, competing with the Blockbuster. But when the broadband internet and the digital consumption started increasing, Netflix immediately recognized that shift in the consumer behavior towards on-demand entertainment. So instead of sticking to the same physical or mail order rental model, they evolved into a streaming platform and now into the world of entertainment content. Netflix adapted to the market evolution rather than resisting the industry disruption. Now, how does evolutionary theory play into this? How does it apply? The gradual adaptation to market trends and the consumer behavior was studied by Netflix, and they evolved. So in 2007, Netflix introduced the streaming services, coexisting with its DVD rental business. In 2010 or around 2010, the company completely phased out DVD and they gained the dominance in the streaming world. 2013, Netflix entered into the content production with the original series like House of Cards. And today, the company in original films and series, shaping or reshaping the global entertainment trends. So here, Netflix, unlike Uber, did not disrupt overnight. They gradually adapted to the consumer preferences mainly being shaped by the technology advancement. And Netflix purely ride on those technology advancements. The outcome, Netflix is a leader in global streaming. They have over 230 million subscribers worldwide. They were successful in producing the original content production, the Squid Game, The Crown, Stranger Things. And each of those production truly differentiate from its competitors. And Netflix pretty much effaced competitors like Blockbuster, who did not evolve with the market changes. So Blockbuster can be another example where they did not recognize the need for change. And they held on to the business model which they are familiar with. So Netflix gradual adaptation strategy ensured a long-term success as well as the industry dominance. Now let's take a look at how some of the principles or some of the key concepts in change management. So the theories are now leading into these key concepts, which are very critical for us to keep in mind, where we can apply, we can see the resonance of these concepts in any type of changes. So the first one is whether change is predetermined or constructed trajectories. So when we say predetermined, then it follows a life cycle and an evolutionary theory. The definition says change unfolds in a predictable way based on pre-existing conditions, environmental pressures, or internal processes. So organizations follow a natural progression similar to what we see in biology, the biological growth, moving through the stages of innovation, growth, maturity, and decline. So we can see the same way we discussed Blockbuster, Kodak, the photography company, it followed a predictable decline when it failed to embrace the digital photography. And when it embraced, it was too late. We also saw the automobile industry evolution, the shift from gasoline to electric vehicles, driven by the market trends and environmental factors. Now let's take a look at the constructed change. The constructed change would be teleological and dialectical theories, where change is intentional, it is goal-driven, it is shaped by strategic decisions. Organizations have the ability to disrupt industries and redefine markets through deliberate action. Example would be Apple's iPhone launch, where Apple intentionally disrupted the mobile phone industry with a vision driving the innovation strategy. Tesla's market entry, Tesla challenged the traditional automakers and forced the industry to accelerate the EV adoption. So organizations don't just react, they can actively shape their future through bold strategic choices. So Apple is a perfect example where they have constantly embodied these bold strategic choices where they shape the future of many industries, computing, entertainment, music industry, so on and so forth. So the key idea here is the prominent role of decision makers. Change follows either a rigid or flexible path based on the strategic leadership. So rigid trajectories occur when organizations fail to adapt. And many times those rigid trajectories would end up in demise. Example, Blockbuster, resisting the digital streaming, Kodak, resisting the digital adoption. Flexible trajectories emerge when leaders take control of transformation, Netflix is the prominent example where they shifted from mail order DVD to their kiosk and finally to streaming. And the strategic decisions dictate whether change is an opportunity or a threat. So understanding the change, whether the change is predetermined or constructed, help leaders navigate the challenges, seize the opportunities, and drive sustainable success for the change. So change, we discussed, it's not a single event. It's a sequence of interconnected decisions and events that constantly shape its outcome. The order in which change occurs can reinforce or hinder success. In this discussion, we would explore how the sequence of change impact results, how it can manage a reactive and self-reinforcing sequences effectively. So change is unfolded step where each action influences the subsequent development. Decisions made early in the change process set the foundation for success or failure. Let's look at Amazon's digital transformation. It began with a smaller scale. We all remember Jeff Bezos' online book sales. It later expanded into e-commerce, and it started establishing its dominance through data-driven decisions and continuous innovation. Now it's in different industries, different places. Earlier actions influence the later ones, shaping the overall trajectory. Poor early decisions can create long-term obstacles, while well-planned sequences drive sustainable progress. I remember the Boeing 737 MAX crisis. It was a rushed product launch, which led to safety failures, multiple safety failures, resulting in a very costly recalls and reputational damage. The Apple's ecosystem strategy, which started with iPod and iTunes, then expanded into the seamless experience of iPhone, iCloud, and Apple services are also example of how early actions would influence the later ones. Now let's take a look at reactive and self-reinforcing sequences. Reactive sequences are responses triggered by unexpected resistance or external pressures, leading to unintended setbacks. Blockbuster's failure to adapt to streaming service and reacting too late gave way to Netflix for their rise. Self-reinforcing sequences, the small success steps that build the momentum to create the path dependence. Example would be Google's evolution from a search engine to an AI and a cloud powerhouse, leveraging each innovation to fuel the next step. So the sequence and change matters. Understanding these steps would be fundamental, whereby leaders can strategically plan each phase, anticipating challenges and reinforcing successes early on to achieve the desired transformation. Change, as we discussed many times, is not a linear process. Reactive sequences emerge when conflicting goals create resistance. And these resistance would be applied to the shifting trajectory of change. So leaders may initiate change, but the responses from stakeholders and external forces often influence whether it succeeds or fails. So this occurs when conflicting goals create resistance to change. So different groups within an organization may have opposing interest, leading to unintended consequences. The classic example is Yahoo's leadership change in 2000. Multiple CEO transitions, building different kinds of visions, led to inconsistent strategic directions, which truly frustrated employees and investors. Leaders may introduce a change, which we can call here as event A, and the responses, which would be coming from stakeholders like B, C, D, or even from the stakeholders B, C, D, may shift its direction. Change, oftentimes in this case, evolve unpredictably due to the stakeholder reactions. Another example is Google Glass. When they introduced this in 2014, it was an innovative wearable, but very quickly the privacy concerns and other stakeholder reactions came into the it created a backlash, forced Google to reposition only Google Glass for its enterprise use. So negative reactions can block or transform the change process. Unintended pushbacks can halt the progress or force adjustments. Another example is New Coke, which was introduced in 1985. Coca-Cola reformulated the classic beverage, which led consumers outrage, and they finally have to return back to the original formula. I still think the original Coke was the best Coke that Coke ever produced. So leaders always should anticipate resistance and should have a very proper feedback loop, ensuring that reactive sequences do not derail their vision. Now let's take a look at self-reinforcing sequences. So some decisions can create positive feedback loops, and those change would lead to self-reinforcing sequences, because these cycles accelerate successes. Either it will accelerate success or can trap organizations in an ineffective pattern. So understanding these sequences help leaders amplify positive effects and avoid reinforcing poor decisions. So decisions create positive feedback loops, which reinforce the earlier events. Here, actions and decisions build a momentum, which will reinforce the direction of change. So Amazon Prime, the ecosystem started as a fast shipping membership. They expanded the streaming services, exclusive deals, and benefits to those members. And each addition built the market interest, leading to customer loyalty, revenue, and then it started reinforcing the success. So this is a very classic example for the positive change for self-reinforcing sequence. Now, not all self-reinforcing sequence will lead to an outcome like an Amazon Prime ecosystem. Kodak's digital hesitation, because their success in film made them resistant to digitally transform. The customers were all dependent on, they have the largest company in the film industry with supply chain vendors, other companies supporting them. It was very, very hard for them to think about yet another way by which the market would interact, taking pictures and photographs and sharing it with their loved ones. So that early success in the traditional way of film here created a negative effect for the self-reinforcing sequence. The key drivers here is increasing returns, the psychological commitment, and cognitive bias. So when we look at, let's take a look at one more example. The Microsoft shift from Windows-only strategy. Their first focus was only Windows-based software. They clearly recognized the cloud computing trend like Amazon, like Apple, and other giants like Google. Rather than sticking on to the Windows-only strategy, they adapted to the strategy by investing in Azure and cross-platform services, which was critical for them to ensure the long-term growth. So here, the leaders must evaluate feedback loops carefully, reinforcing the positive trajectories while avoiding a lock-in or path dependency or an outdated decision. Now let's take a look at increasing returns in change management. So here, how the initial investments and choices can create a self-reinforcing cycle, which lead to a greater future benefits. But one should be careful that these increasing returns can also lock organization into an outdated technology or strategy. So the more an organization invests in a particular technology or strategy, the harder it is for them to switch. The Windows dominance of Microsoft, because Windows became the industry standard, software developers started building their applications based on Windows. The entire corporate world was focused on Windows. So the market dominance for Windows was a very prominent mainstream reinforcement strategy. When we look at other examples like QWERTY keyboard, VHS and Betamax, Nokia, once the market leader for cell phone industry or mobile market, it failed to adapt to the smartphone revolution, leading to its decline. There are several factors that would lead to one or the other alternate destiny. Setup cost, learning effects, coordination benefits, and choosing the dominant option. So increasing returns thus can drive success or a lock-in failure. So the companies must recognize when to commit versus when to pivot, and how organizations would balance innovation versus the risk of the path dependencies. I have a feeling that this is going to go into this video. Okay, let's take a few examples of all of these different change. The first one is Tesla. Here, this is a predetermined change. The traditional car manufacturers incrementally improved the gasoline engines, conserving the energy, but they never went into into something that is radically alternative. They focused in fuel efficiency, emission control, and performance. They wanted to follow a predictable trajectory of innovation. The constructed change here is Tesla challenged those industry norms by developing a high-performance electric vehicle, EVs, with an advanced battery technology. So the incremental improvements that Tesla made, they were able to reimagine the transportation focusing on battery innovation, longer ranges, rapid charging, software-driven cars, the autonomous driving, over-the-air updates, navigation, a direct-to-consumer model by bypassing completely the traditional dealerships. The outcome here is Tesla's influence on the market. Their success forced traditional automakers like Ford, GM, Volkswagen to bring their own versions of EV. The governments worldwide introduced regulations and incentives to support the EV adoption. And this shift to EV is now the dominant trajectory, providing that disruptive innovation can reshape the entire industry. Very similar to Tesla, it's Uber's rise in the transportation industry challenged the long-standing taxi regulation by introducing the ride-sharing model. Uber clearly bypassed the traditional taxi licensing and disrupted the urban mobility worldwide. This rapid transformation, even though met with significant legal resistance, it was able to overcome those resistance in many, many countries, establishing Uber as an adaptive strategy. They pursued negotiations in places like New York and London. They came up with new licensing policies, but Germany and Denmark, Uber was strictly banned. Nevertheless, irrespective of all of the setbacks, Uber truly transformed the urban transportation. It forced the traditional taxis to adopt an app-based booking and dynamic pricing. Now let's take a look at Nokia's decline because of the negative effect of the self-reinforcing decision. So Nokia, we all know it very well, dominated the mobile phone industry as late as in early 2000s. And even though smartphones was coming into the marketplace, Nokia was still stuck with their Symbian operating system, believing that their market position is secure. This decision, I believe, was driven by a psychological commitment because of the previous success. So Apple's iPhone was introduced in 2007, and Android devices was gaining traction, but it was too late for Nokia to come up with an innovative way by which they can compete effectively in the marketplace. So Nokia's market collapse was the outcome. Apple and Android overtook the Nokia, offering more user-friendly and developer-supported platforms. And Nokia attempted to partner with Microsoft's Windows OS, but it was too late. Sales was going down, and Nokia was forced to sell its mobile division to Microsoft in 2014. So Nokia's decline shows how the self-reinforced decision can create a path dependency where the leaders become locked into outdated strategies. Now let's take a look at VHS versus Betamax. So the battle between Sony's Betamax and JVC's VHS in the home video market during the late 20th century is a prime example of increasing returns in change management. Despite Sony's product being technically superior, VHS emerged as a dominant standard, illustrating how market adoption and strategic advantages outweigh the product quality. So when we look at the early competition in 1970s, Sony's Betamax and JVC's VHS competed as the home video recording formats. For sure, Betamax was higher quality, sharper images, and better audio. But VHS had a longer recording time and was cheaper to produce. So that increased returns created the market adoption and momentum because VHS had lower manufacturing cost and a broader support from different kinds of industry standards. So movie studios preferred VHS because they can have longer tapes and they can cover a full-length film. There are more VHS players and tapes in the market, which reinforce the consumer preference and slowly accelerating its dominance. So VHS then became the standard and the Betamax faded, even though they are technologically very sophisticated. Now let's take a look at cognitive biases in change management. Cognitive bias can significantly impact decision makers. If it's a larger company, when leaders become overconfident in their choices and ignore the feedback, they may drive projects towards failure. I remember watching an interview between Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and Bill Gates clearly communicated this. His biggest fear is the cognitive bias and how he would be able to connect himself to the ground truth of the shifting industry, shifting market preference, and shifting ways by which Microsoft needs to advance, go to the next stage. It's very easy for change leaders to develop the biased views based on their success and based on the selective information that they read or that they acquire. And confirmation bias leads them to seek many times only data that support their theories or their views or their successes and dismiss the contradictory evidence. So this overconfidence and ignoring the feedback will lead to a negative consequences. In many organizations, there's a factor called groupthink. Groupthink, when leaders and teams suppress dissenting information, dissenting opinions, dissenting feedback, that will create or that will lead to a self-reinforcing cycle where only supportive voices are heard, magnifying the poor choices. Some of the examples would be like a major bank launched an automation project to reduce operational cost. Leadership ignored the customer resistance, assuming that automation would be universally accepted. And despite repeated warnings from customer service teams, executives dismissed their concerns, pushing ahead. And the result was widespread customer dissatisfaction, leading to significant loss in customer loyalty and revenue. So cognitive bias can make leaders blind to risks and resistance to adapt. And successful change management requires active listening, open debate, and a willingness to reconsider strategies when confronted with real-world challenges. You know, when you are in meetings, if a successive team or adaptive team or an agile team or a high-performing team meetings, each employee or each participant will be voicing their opinion, and the leaders would be actively listening to those opinions. They will never dismiss the opinion of others. Whereas an organization which are locked in, the leaders truly believe their voices and ignore the voice of the team. So that leads to the path dependence in organizations. It's a phenomenon where early decisions shape future possibilities, making it increasingly difficult for organizations to pivot. Time, these self-reinforcing practices narrow down the available alternatives, reducing the flexibility. And the constant path dependence, where decisions based on short-term advantages without considering long-term consequences create pitfalls. Because once a particular direction is chosen, reinforcing mechanisms makes it difficult to change. And a critical juncture occurs when the organization commits to a specific approach. And this triggers the self-reinforcing practices where investment, market position, oftentimes deepens the reliance on that chosen path. And over time, alternative strategies disappear, making pivots more complex and costly. This was the classic case study of Nokia's commitment to Symbian OS, where Nokia completely coupled with the technology. They committed to the Symbian OS. They couldn't diversify into smartphones and touch screens, whereas they were becoming the standard. And slowly they lost the market share. So it's very important to recognize the organizational lock-in and the risks associated with the organizational lock-in. We talked about Kodak. Kodak, in fact, invented the digital photography, but they never adapted the digital photography until it was too late. They completely focused on the film. Leadership feared that the digital innovation, which they themselves came up with, would cannibalize the film sale. So they delayed the innovation. But digital photography becoming the standard and preferred way by which customers were using it, Kodak lost the market dominance. And Kodak finally filed their bankruptcy in 2012, proving that failure to adapt can become fatal. So organizational lock-in is a silent killer of innovation. Business must constantly evaluate their strategies. They should challenge the existing assumptions and be willing to disrupt their own models to stay ahead. So let's take a look at minimizing the impact of these reactive sequences. Change is difficult. Change is not smooth. So reactive sequences emerge when different parties pursue conflicting interest, leading to delays, leading to resistance, or even failure. So you need to understand the reactive sequences. Reactive sequences occur when stakeholders push back against a proposed change. There creates conflicting priorities, which create friction between leadership, employees, and external parties. A company rolling out automation may face union resistance due to job security concerns. Many times, reactive sequences are hard to detect because employees may not voice their concerns openly, fearing the backlash. Resistances are passive, delayed action, and lack of commitment, or it can be active when it is too late, many cases, protest and legal battles. A healthcare reform can meet the silent resistance from physicians who refuse to adopt new policies, slowing down the implementation. Some of the strategies to minimize resistance is to anticipate the potential opposition through stakeholder engagement. The leader should be scanning for early warning signs like hesitancy, lack of buy-in, or silent pushbacks, they need to respond quickly and adapt messaging to reassure the concerned groups. One should not discount the power of stakeholder analysis. Mapping the power dynamics in an organization would help predict the resistance points. Understanding who hold the influence can guide better change communication. Tech companies oftentimes engage employee advocates early to drive that cultural shift. Now let's take a look at how do we minimize the impact of self-reinforcing sequences. So the danger is when organizations fall into an entrapment where the past decisions are dictating the future choices. The early successes leading to overconfidence. And how do we minimize the cognitive bias and rigidity, where leaders are committing to past strategies, thinking that that will continuously produce the same results, where they're ignoring the external changes, reducing the flexibility to adjust to the new market conditions. Breaking free from the path dependency, where leaders must reintroduce alternative choices into decision making. They should encourage external perspectives, challenge the existing assumptions. They should have multiple innovation strategies, balancing existing products with future investments. Now, change always unravel itself or unfold in waves of stability and disruption. This is the concept of punctuated equilibrium. Organizations must navigate cycles of reinforcement and reaction to remain adaptable in a rapidly shifting environment. So punctuated equilibrium means stability versus disruption. Organizations may experience long periods of stability with incremental improvements, and external forces like technology shifts, regulatory changes, or market disruptions can trigger major transformation. The role of self-reinforcing and reactive sequences create structured routines that increases efficiency but limit flexibility. Reactive sequences introduce disruptions that forces organizations to pivot. Leaders must recognize cycles of reinforcement and reaction in order to make timely strategic decisions. Overcommitment to stability can lead to stagnation. The opposite side, the constant reactionary change can create instability. Microsoft successfully transformed from software licensing to services, balancing stability with innovation. So change management should not be misinterpreted. It's not about resisting disruption, but about managing its cycles effectively. And successful organizations strike a delicate balance between reinforcing what works and adapting to new realities. Let's take a look at Boeing 737 MAX crisis. The 737 MAX in 2018 and 2019 resulted in 346 fatalities, triggering a worldwide concern. Boeing initially known this, they downplayed the role of the software flaws that happened in these crashes. They did not take proactive corrective actions. So regulators, airlines, and the public demanded accountability, setting the stage for escalating the consequences. These mounting pressures were the reactive sequences. So scrutiny intensified, Boeing delayed and defended their responses, which worsened the public perception. And government and regulatory agencies banned the aircraft worldwide, forcing an industry-wide grounding for all of the 737 MAX. These airlines, or they canceled billions in orders. The shareholders lost confidence and Boeing's market position suffered. The outcome was terrible. They were forced to redesign its safety system, a complete overhaul in corporate decision-making, and they had to rebuild the trust. The FAA and the global regulators imposed very stricter oversight, changing the aviation industry's safety approval process. So this crisis highlighted the dangers of reactive responses, showing the proactive risk management as the key to adapt in the change management cycle. We discussed about Kodak's failure to adapt. They fell into the self-reinforcing trap. Cognitive bias and commitment to old business models hindered their growth. Their executives ignored the customer behavior, assuming the brand loyalty would sustain the film industry, where digital cameras were gaining popularity. Kodak heavily invested in film technology, instead of embracing the digital revolution. So Nokia's rise and fall was also a classic example illustrating the dynamics of punctuated equilibrium, a period of dominance followed by the stagnation and eventual disruption. Their self-reinforcing success created the complacency, preventing it from fully embracing the smartphones. The shift from hardware-centric phones to software-driven ecosystem like iOS and Android, it caught Nokia off guard. Despite its early investment in touchscreen, Nokia's leadership were coupled with the Symbian OS, dismissing the impact creating in the marketplace from iPhone. So Nokia's case highlight how self-reinforcing strategies can create stagnation in the marketplace, which is a rapidly evolving market. So to survive, organization must recognize where stability must give way to transformation and avoid rigid attachment to the past success. So now we will move on to chapter 2, leading change from a process perspective. Since this video is a long video, I would record that as a different video. Thank you, everybody. Looking forward for chapter 2 discussions.